The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Dr. Elena Rodriguez didn't notice. She sat hunched over her computer screen in the control room of the massive radio telescope, watching endless streams of data scroll past her tired eyes. Outside the thick windows, the Puerto Rican night was so dark she could barely make out the giant dish pointing toward the stars. This was her life now. 3 years of night shifts, 3 years of listening to space static, 3 years of hoping to hear something extraordinary. Most nights all she got was the usual cosmic background noise, the universe's way of reminding her how empty and quiet it really was. Elena stretched her back and glanced at the clock. 3:30 a.m. Still 3 hours until her replacement would arrive, still 3 hours of staring at squiggly lines and radio waves that meant absolutely nothing. She wondered, not for the first time, if she had made the right choice joining the search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Project. Her friends from college were all doing well. Some had normal jobs with normal hours, going home to their families every evening. Others were making groundbreaking discoveries in labs around the world. And here she was, sitting alone in a control room in the middle of nowhere, chasing signals that probably didn't exist. The facility was almost completely empty at this hour. Just her, the security guard making his rounds, and the endless hum of computers processing data from deep space. Sometimes Elena felt like she was the only person on Earth still awake, the only one still hoping that somewhere out there, someone, might be trying to talk to us. She took another sip of her cold coffee and made a face. The stuff tasted like motor oil, but it was the only thing keeping her alert. Her supervisor had warned all the new team members about the night shift. "It's lonely work," he had said. "Not everyone can handle it. You spend a lot of time with your own thoughts." Elena had thought she could handle anything. She had always been good at working alone, good at focusing on details that others missed. In college, she was the one who stayed up all night in the lab while her classmates went to parties. She was the one who double-checked calculations that everyone else trusted. She was the one who noticed patterns where others saw only chaos. But this was different. This wasn't just working alone. This was working with the constant knowledge that you might be wasting your time. Every night, she analyzed thousands of signals from space. Every night, they all turned out to be natural phenomena, pulsars, quasars, radio galaxies, or just plain old cosmic static. The computer beeped softly, the same sound it made every few minutes when it finished processing another batch of data. Elena glanced at the screen without much interest. More squiggly lines, more random noise from the vast emptiness between stars. But something was different this time. Elena sat up straighter, her exhaustion forgotten. The pattern on her screen wasn't like the usual random spikes and dips she saw every night. This looked almost organized, like someone had taken the chaos of space static and tried to turn it into something meaningful. She leaned closer to the monitor, her heart starting to beat faster. The signal was definitely unusual. It had a rhythm to it, a repetition that natural phenomena just didn't have. She quickly pulled up the analysis software and started running the data through different filters. The more she looked at it, the more convinced she became that this wasn't just another cosmic accident. The signal had structure, patterns within. Patterns, like a message wrapped inside a puzzle wrapped inside another message. Elena's hands shook slightly as she typed commands into her computer. According to her training, she should document everything, run it through the standard verification protocols, and then report it to her supervisor in the morning. But something told her this was too important to wait. She pulled up the facility's transmission logs to see if they had been sending anything in this direction recently. The SETI project didn't just listen, they also sent signals out into space, hoping that someone might hear them and respond. What she found made her stomach drop. 3 days ago, the facility had transmitted a standard mathematical sequence toward this exact region of space. It was a simple pattern, prime numbers, basic mathematics that any intelligent species should be able to recognize. They had done this thousands of times before, sending the same signal in different directions, never expecting a response. But now, looking at the data on her screen, Elena could see that something had not only received their transmission, but had responded to it. The signal she was receiving contained the same mathematical sequence they had sent out, but with additions, modifications, improvements. Someone had taken their message, understood it, and sent back a better version. Elena stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to process what this meant. If she was right, if this really was a response to their transmission, then everything was about to change. Not just for her, not just for the SETI project, but for all of humanity. She reached for her phone to call her supervisor, then stopped. What if she was wrong? What if this was just some kind of equipment malfunction or interference from a satellite, or a dozen other boring explanations that would make her look foolish? But as she continued to analyze the signal, one thing became increasingly clear. It wasn't coming from deep space like she had first assumed. The signal was strong, much stronger than anything they typically received from distant stars. And according to her calculations, it was coming from somewhere much, much closer. Somewhere on Earth. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She ran the calculations again, double-checking her work, but the result was the same. Whatever was sending, this signal was somewhere in Puerto Rico, probably within a few hundred miles of the facility. She printed out the data and grabbed her portable receiver from the equipment closet. Her supervisor would probably be angry that she was leaving her post, but Elena knew she wouldn't be able to concentrate on anything else until she figured out what was sending this signal. As she walked toward the exit, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever. She had spent 3 years listening to the silence of space, hoping to hear something extraordinary. Now it seemed like something extraordinary had been trying to talk to her all along. Elena had never lied to her supervisor before, but she couldn't bring herself to tell Dr. Martinez the real reason she needed to borrow the portable equipment. "Just some calibration work in the field," she had said, avoiding his eyes. "You know how these old receivers can get finicky." He had bought it, thankfully. Now she was driving her beat-up Jeep down a winding mountain road toward the El Yunque rainforest, following the coordinates her calculations had given her. The portable receiver sat on the passenger seat, its small screen showing that the mysterious signal was getting stronger with every mile. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Elena had always loved this time of day. Those quiet moments when the world was waking up, but still peaceful. Today, though, she felt anything but peaceful. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and her mind raced with possibilities. What if she was making a huge mistake? What if the signal was just coming from some illegal radio station hidden in the mountains? Or worse, what if it was some kind of military experiment that she wasn't supposed to know about? Elena pushed these thoughts away and focused on the road ahead. The coordinates led her deeper into the forest than she had ever been before. She parked her Jeep at the end of a barely visible dirt trail and gathered her equipment: the portable receiver, her camera, her notebook, and a thermos of coffee that was actually hot this time. She also brought a GPS device, though she wasn't sure how well it would work under the thick canopy of trees. The forest was incredibly quiet. Elena had expected to hear birds singing or insects buzzing, but there was an unusual stillness in the air. Even her footsteps seemed muffled by the soft ground covered in fallen leaves and moss. She followed the signal deeper into the trees, checking the receiver every few minutes. The pattern was still there, that same organized, intelligent response to their original transmission. But now she could see that it was more complex than she had first realized. There were layers to it, like a song with multiple melodies playing at the same time. After walking for about an hour, Elena noticed that the trees around her were changing. They seemed taller, more ancient, with trunks so wide that 3 people, holding hands, couldn't reach around them. The light filtering through the leaves had a strange quality to it, almost greenish, like she was walking underwater. The receiver's signal strength jumped suddenly, and Elena looked up from the small screen. In front of her was a clearing that definitely hadn't been on any of the maps she had studied before leaving the facility. It was a perfect circle, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by those massive ancient trees, but it wasn't the clearing itself that made Elena stop breathing. It was what stood in the center of it. The structure, if she could even call it that, was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't quite round and wasn't quite square, but seemed to shift between different shapes as she looked at it. The surface was smooth and reflected light in a way that reminded her of oil on water, showing colors that shifted from deep blue to silver to something that didn't have a name. Elena's scientific training kicked in, and she immediately started taking pictures and measurements. The structure was about 20 feet tall and seemed to be made of some kind of material that was both solid and liquid at the same time. When she held up her receiver, the signal strength was off the charts. She circled the structure slowly, documenting everything she could see. There were no doors, no windows, no obvious way inside, but as she completed her second trip around it, something incredible happened. A section of the wall simply melted away, like ice disappearing in warm water. Elena jumped back, her heart pounding, but she couldn't look away from the opening that had appeared. From inside the structure, a figure emerged. Elena's first thought was that she must be hallucinating from lack of sleep and too much coffee, because what she was seeing was impossible. The being that stepped into the clearing was clearly not human, but it was beautiful in a way that made her chest tight and her eyes water. The figure was tall, maybe 7 feet, with long limbs that moved with incredible grace. Its skin seemed to contain light, shifting and glowing like the northern lights she had seen in photographs. But it was the face that took Elena's breath away. The features were delicate and symmetrical, with large eyes that held depths like looking into space itself. Above the being's head, barely visible, was what looked like a crown made of pure light. It flickered and danced, never quite the same, patterned twice. Elena stood frozen, her camera hanging forgotten in her hand. The being looked directly at her, and she felt like it was seeing not just her face, but somehow looking into her thoughts, her memories, her dreams. Without meaning to, without even realizing she was going to speak, Elena whispered, "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The words hung in the air between them. The being's expression changed slightly. Elena could have sworn she saw understanding there, and maybe something that looked like sadness. Then, slowly, gracefully, the being turned away from her. But it didn't go back into the structure. Instead, it moved to the far side of the clearing and seemed to wait. Elena realized that this wasn't a rejection or dismissal. It was an invitation. The being was giving her time to process what she was seeing, to decide what she wanted to do next. Elena looked down at her hands and saw that they were shaking. She looked at her equipment and realized that none of it was working properly anymore. The camera showed only static, the receiver was giving impossible readings, and even her watch had stopped. But Elena didn't care about any of that anymore. She took a deep breath, walked across the clearing, and sat down on a fallen log about 10 feet away from the most incredible discovery in human history. The being turned back toward her, and Elena could see something that might have been a smile. Then it raised one long, graceful hand, and patterns of light began to dance in the air between them. Elena realized that someone was trying to talk to her. Elena didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those dancing patterns of light, felt the weight of those deep, knowing eyes looking right through her soul. She had driven back to her small apartment in a daze, her mind trying to process what had happened in that impossible clearing. By morning, she had almost convinced herself it was all a dream. Maybe the stress of 3 years on the night shift had finally gotten to her. Maybe she had fallen asleep at her desk and imagined the whole thing. But when she looked at her equipment, she found something that made her heart race all over again. Her notebook was filled with drawings she didn't remember making. Page after page of light patterns, geometric shapes, symbols that looked almost like mathematical equations, but more beautiful, more alive than any math she had ever seen. Her own handwriting, but showing things her mind shouldn't have been able to imagine. Elena called in sick to work and drove back to the forest. The clearing was exactly where she had left it, and so was the being. It seemed to be waiting for her, sitting gracefully on what looked like a chair made of the same shifting, flowing material as the structure. When Elena appeared through the trees, the being stood and made a gesture that somehow clearly meant welcome. This time, Elena came prepared. She had brought a folding chair, snacks, water, and most importantly, several notebooks and colored pencils. If this being was trying to communicate through light patterns, she was going to do her best to understand and respond. The being seemed pleased by her preparation. As Elena settled into her chair, those incredible patterns of light began to dance in the air again. But now, watching more carefully, Elena started to see that they weren't random. There was structure to them, grammar, meaning. Simple patterns came first, a circle of blue light that pulsed gently. Elena drew it in her notebook, then held up the drawing. The being nodded, actually nodded like a human would, and the light pattern appeared again, but this time with small variations. Elena realized this was like a language lesson. The being was teaching her the basics, starting with simple concepts and building up to more complex ideas. Over the next few hours, she learned that steady blue light meant something like agreement or yes. Flickering red patterns seemed to indicate questions. Golden spirals appeared to represent concepts or ideas. But it was more than just a code. The light patterns had emotion to them, beauty that made Elena's chest tight with feelings she couldn't name. When the being showed her a complex swirling pattern of silver and green, Elena felt overwhelmed with a sense of peace and belonging that brought tears to her eyes. By the time the sun was setting, Elena had filled half her notebook with drawings and had begun to understand some basic exchanges. She had learned that the being's name was something that translated roughly to the concept of keeper of the last garden, not just a name, but a title that carried weight and responsibility. More importantly, she had started to understand that this being was incredibly lonely. Elena returned the next day, and the next, and the next. Each session built on the previous one, and slowly, a picture began to emerge through their light language conversations. The keeper was not just a visitor to Earth. She was a guardian, one of the last of her kind, watching over worlds that showed potential for growth and wisdom. Through cascading patterns of light, the keeper showed Elena visions that took her breath away. Earth as it had been millions of years ago, with creatures and plants that no longer existed, landscapes of impossible beauty. But also Earth as it could be, cities that worked in harmony with nature, humans who had learned to live without destroying their home, technology that healed instead of harmed. Elena began to understand that she hadn't discovered the keeper by accident. She had been chosen, tested through months of night shift work, to see if she had the patience and dedication needed for this contact. The radio signals had been just the beginning, a way to draw her attention and guide her to this place. But as the days passed, Elena noticed something troubling. The keeper was becoming less solid, her light patterns fainter. Sometimes she seemed almost transparent, like she was fading away. When Elena managed to ask about this through their shared language, the response filled her with dread. The keeper was dying, or perhaps leaving was a better word. Her kind didn't die the way humans did, but they could choose to move on when their work was complete. She had been on Earth for thousands of years, watching, waiting for the right moment to make contact with humanity. That moment, was now. But there was a problem. Through increasingly urgent light patterns, the Keeper explained that Earth was at a critical point in its development. The choices humans made in the next few decades would determine not just their own survival, but whether they would be ready to join a larger community of intelligent species that existed throughout the galaxy. The Keeper's people had guided other worlds through this transition, but always carefully, gradually, making sure each species was ready for the knowledge and responsibility that came with galactic citizenship. Humans, however, were approaching this critical point faster than expected, and there hadn't been time for the usual gradual preparation. Elena realized that she was being given information that could change the course of human history. The Keeper showed her glimpses of other worlds, other species that had successfully made the transition from isolated planetary civilizations to members of something vast and wonderful. But she also saw worlds that had failed, that had destroyed themselves, or been left alone to struggle with problems they weren't ready to solve. The weight of this knowledge was almost too much to bear. Elena found herself crying during their sessions, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she was learning and the responsibility that came with it. The Keeper seemed to understand, and her light patterns became gentler, more comforting. But time was running out. Each day, the Keeper became a little less present, a little more distant, and each day Elena understood more clearly that soon she would have to make a choice that would affect not just her own life, but the future of her entire species. The Keeper was preparing to leave, and she wanted Elena to come with her. Elena's hands shook as she sat across from Dr. Martinez in his office. She had been dreading this conversation for days, but she couldn't keep making excuses for her absences. Her supervisor was looking at her with the kind of concern that made her stomach twist into knots. "Elena, I'm worried about you," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "You've been calling in sick, showing up late, and when you are here, you seem completely distracted. The other team members have noticed too. What's going on?" Elena stared at the folder on his desk that contained her employment records. 3 years of perfect attendance, detailed reports, exemplary work. All of that was about to disappear because of what she had discovered in the forest. "I know this is going to sound crazy," she began, then stopped. How could she possibly explain what had happened? How could she tell him about the Keeper, about the light language, about the choice she was facing? Dr. Martinez waited patiently, but Elena could see the worry growing deeper in his eyes. She pulled out her notebook, the one filled with drawings of light patterns and symbols that meant nothing to anyone but her. "I've been working on something," she said carefully. "Something related to the signals we've been receiving. I think I might have made a breakthrough." She showed him the notebook, explaining as best she could about the patterns she had discovered, the mathematical relationships, the way the signals seemed to respond to their transmissions. But as she talked, she could see his expression changing, from interest to confusion to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Elena," he said gently, "these are just drawings. Beautiful drawings, but they don't correspond to any of the data in our systems. I've checked the logs for the past 2 weeks. The signals you're describing, they don't exist." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She grabbed his computer and pulled up the transmission records, searching frantically for the data that had started everything. But the files showed nothing unusual, just the same cosmic background noise they recorded every night. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I have the recordings. I have the calculations. The signal was coming from coordinates in the forest, and I followed it, and I found—" She trailed off, seeing the look in Dr. Martinez's eyes. He thought she was having some kind of breakdown. And looking at the evidence, or lack of it, Elena could understand why. "I think you need to take some time off," he said softly. "Real time off. Maybe talk to someone. Get some perspective. The night shift can be tough on people. It makes you see things that aren't there, hear patterns in random noise." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to show him the photographs she had taken. But when she had developed them, they showed nothing but empty forest clearings. The recordings from her equipment contained only static. Even her GPS device showed no record of the coordinates where she had found the clearing. It was as if the Keeper existed in a space that their technology couldn't see or understand. That night, Elena sat in her apartment surrounded by notebooks full of drawings that no one else could understand. She looked at the symbols, the light patterns, the mathematical concepts that the Keeper had shared with her. To her, they were as clear as words on a page. But to everyone else, they were just the confused scribbles of someone who had spent too much time alone. She thought about calling her sister or her old friends from college, but what would she say? That she had been talking to an alien in the forest? That she was being offered a chance to travel to another world? They would have her committed to a mental health facility. Elena realized she was facing an impossible choice, but not the one she had expected. She had thought the Keeper would ask her to choose between staying on Earth or going to the stars. But the real choice was much harder than that. She could abandon everything, her contact with the Keeper, the incredible knowledge she had gained, the most important discovery in human history, and try to rebuild her normal life. Or she could continue meeting with the Keeper, knowing that it would cost her everything she had worked for, everyone she cared about, and probably her reputation as a scientist. The next morning, Elena made her decision. She drove to the forest, one more time. The Keeper was waiting for her, but Elena could see that she was even fainter than before, almost translucent in the morning light. Through their shared language of light, the Keeper expressed concern and understanding. She had known this would happen. Elena managed to communicate her situation, and the Keeper's response filled her with both wonder and terror. The choice Elena thought she was facing wasn't about her career or her reputation. It was much bigger than that. The Keeper explained that Earth was approaching a moment of critical decision, not just for Elena, but for all of humanity. The climate was changing faster than expected, resources were running low, and conflicts between nations were growing more dangerous. Without guidance, without the knowledge that came with joining the galactic community, humans might not survive the next century, but the rules that governed contact between species were strict. The Keeper could only share her knowledge with one human, and that human would have to find a way to prepare their species for eventual contact. Elena would have to plant seeds of understanding, work within human institutions to get people ready for what was coming, even if no one believed her about where the knowledge came from. The alternative was that the Keeper would leave, taking with her humanity's chance at guided evolution. Earth would be left to face its challenges alone, and the Keeper's people would not interfere again for thousands of years. Elena understood now why she had been chosen. Not because she was the smartest scientist or the most important person, but because she was willing to sacrifice everything for knowledge, even if it meant standing alone. The Keeper showed her one final vision: Earth as it could be if humanity made the right choices. Cities powered by clean energy, forests restored, oceans healed, and humans working together instead of fighting each other. It was beautiful beyond words, and Elena knew she would do anything to help make it real, even if it meant everyone thinking she was crazy. Elena knew this would be their last night together. She could feel it in the way the Keeper's light patterns had become slower, more deliberate, like someone choosing their final words carefully. The clearing felt different too, quieter, more sacred, as if the forest itself understood that something important was ending. She had brought a thermos of hot chocolate instead of coffee and a thick blanket to sit on. If this was goodbye, she wanted to be comfortable for it. The Keeper seemed amused by these preparations, her light language flickering with what Elena had learned to recognize as gentle laughter. They sat together in silence for a while, watching the stars through the canopy of ancient trees. Elena had never noticed how bright the stars were from this clearing, brighter than they appeared anywhere else on Earth. She wondered if that was natural, or if the keeper's presence somehow made it easier to see the distant lights. Finally, the keeper began to communicate, and what Elena saw in the dancing patterns of light took her breath away. These weren't just images. They were experiences, feelings, entire lifetimes of knowledge shared in moments that felt like hours. Elena saw the galaxy as the keeper's people knew it. Thousands of worlds, hundreds of intelligent species, all connected by bonds of mutual respect and shared wisdom. She felt what it was like to travel between stars, not in ships of metal and fuel, but through methods that her human mind could barely comprehend. She experienced the joy of species taking their first steps into this larger community, and the sadness of worlds that chose isolation and eventually destroyed themselves. She saw Earth's place in all of this, a young world with incredible potential, but also with the capacity for great destruction. Humans were unique among the species the Keeper had encountered. They had developed technology faster than wisdom, power before understanding, and they stood at a crossroads that would determine not just their survival, but their character as a species. The Keeper showed Elena what would happen if humanity chose the path of cooperation and growth. She saw cities that worked with nature instead of against it, energy that came from the sun and wind and waves instead of being torn from the ground. She saw humans exploring other worlds not as conquerors, but as students, learning from other species and sharing their own unique gifts. But she also saw what would happen if humanity chose the other path. Wars over resources, environmental collapse, the slow fading of a species that had never learned to work together. It was heartbreaking, and Elena found herself crying as the visions played out in the light between them. When the Keeper finished sharing these possibilities, she began to explain Elena's choice. But Elena realized she had already made her decision days ago, maybe even weeks ago. She had known from the moment she first saw the Keeper that this encounter would change everything. "I'm staying," Elena said out loud, speaking in English for the first time in days. "I'm staying on Earth." The Keeper's light patterns conveyed understanding, but also a deep sadness. Through their shared language, she asked Elena why she was choosing to remain when she could travel to worlds beyond imagination, learn secrets that no human had ever known, become part of something vast and wonderful. Elena struggled to put her feelings into the light language, but finally managed to communicate her reasoning. She loved Earth, loved humanity despite all its flaws and mistakes. Humans deserved a chance to grow and learn and make their own choices, even if those choices led to failure. And someone needed to stay behind to plant the seeds of knowledge that might help them make better decisions. The Keeper's response was complex, full of layers that Elena was still learning to understand. Respect, sorrow, hope, and something that felt like pride all swirled together in patterns of silver and gold. As the night grew deeper, the Keeper began to share her final gift. Knowledge that Elena could use, understanding that she could adapt to human science and human ways of thinking. Concepts about energy and environment and cooperation that could help guide humanity toward a better future, if Elena could find ways to introduce them carefully. Elena absorbed everything, writing frantically in her notebooks, sketching diagrams and equations that seemed to flow directly from her mind to the paper. She understood that she was being given the tools she would need for the work ahead. When dawn began to touch the edges of the sky, the Keeper rose from her place at the far side of the clearing. Elena stood too, knowing that their time was at an end. The Keeper moved toward the center of the clearing, toward her impossible structure that seemed to shimmer more brightly as the morning light grew stronger. But before she reached it, she turned back to look at Elena one final time. Elena felt the weight of that gaze, the depth of understanding and connection they had built over these precious days. She whispered again the words that had started everything. Between them, the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. But this time, the words carried the weight of goodbye. The keeper's final message was simple and complex at the same time, conveyed through patterns of light that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. It meant something like, "Until we meet again, when your people are ready." Then she turned away, walked into her structure, and both she and it began to fade like morning mist, touched by sunlight. Within moments, the clearing was empty except for Elena and the ancient trees and the soft sound of birds beginning their morning songs. Elena sat down on her blanket and opened her notebook. She had work to do. Somewhere in these pages of drawings and equations and half-understood concepts, she had the seeds of humanity's future. She had knowledge that could help her species survive and grow and maybe, someday, reach for the stars. It would take time. It would take patience. She would have to work within the scientific community, publish papers that introduced new ideas, gradually find ways to guide human development without revealing where her insights truly came from. Most people would never believe her if she told them the truth, but that was okay. Elena had learned something important from her time with the Keeper. Sometimes the most important work was done quietly, behind the scenes, by people who were willing to plant seeds they might never see grow into trees. She packed up her things and walked back through the forest to her jeep. She had a life to rebuild, a career to resurrect, and a species to help save, and somewhere among the stars, she knew, someone was watching and hoping that humanity would make the right choices. Elena drove home with the morning sun on her face and the weight of the future in her hands, ready to begin the most important work of her life.